In 1942, as the world trembled under the weight of a war unlike anything humanity had ever witnessed, a distant continent, isolated, sun-burned, and often underestimated, prepared itself for a storm it could no longer ignore. Australia, once seen as too far to reach, now lay within striking distance of an enemy moving swiftly across the Pacific. The fall of Singapore had shattered illusions of safety. Darwin smoldered after Japan's brutal air raids, and across the vast inland plains, a new sound began to rise, one of determination forged in steel, sweat and fear. Inside the sprawling wartime factory complexes, dawn light spilled through dust-streaked windows, illuminating rows of machines already roaring to life. Sparks leapt from welding torches, the metallic clang of presses echoed like battlefield gunfire, and the scent of hot oil, steel shavings, and burning metal filled the air. Thousands of Australians, men too old to fight, women stepping onto factory floors for the first time, teenagers with calloused hands and determined eyes, moved with a sense of purpose that grew sharper with every passing week. Every bolt they tightened, every component they shaped, every crate they sealed was more than production. It was survival. It was defiance. It was the belief that a nation on the edge of the world could stand its ground against the might of an empire advancing like a dark tide across Asia and the Pacific. And by the middle of 1942, these factories had achieved the unimaginable. They were producing enough weapons, vehicles, ammunition, and supplies to equip 10 full combat divisions. A feat so staggering, it reshaped Australia's fate in the war. The transformation began in the early months of 1942, when Australia suddenly found itself standing on the edge of a battlefield that stretched far beyond the horizon, reaching from the jungles of Southeast Asia to the open waters of the Pacific. There was no time to breathe, no time to doubt, no time to hesitate. The Japanese advance was swift, ruthless, and shockingly precise. One by one, the protective shields Australia had always believed would stand between it and danger collapsed. Singapore fell like a stone dropped into a dark ocean. Allied strongholds buckled under wave after wave of Japanese offensives. And with each defeat, the thunder of war crept closer to Australia's shores. Inside the government's emergency command centers, makeshift operations rooms carved out of warehouses, school halls, and converted offices, the urgency thickened the air like smoke. Officials from the Department of Munitions, military engineers freshly returned from overseas service, and industrial experts who had once worked peaceful civilian jobs now stood shoulder to shoulder, leaning over giant tables strewn with maps, charts, production reports, and lists of shortages so long they looked almost unreal. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, flickering occasionally, casting pale glows over worried faces etched with exhaustion. Every conversation was tense. Every whispered strategy carried the weight of a nation's survival. The stakes were unmistakable. Australia had mere months, if that, to build an industrial backbone strong enough to withstand a war machine, unlike anything it had prepared for. Factories that had once made refrigerators, farm equipment, bicycles, car parts, or tools were seized, repurposed, or fused into the wartime production network. Large signs were hastily nailed above entryways: Commonwealth Defence Factory, Ammunition Annex, Ordnance Assembly Depot. Inside these buildings, chaos rapidly transformed into choreography. Machines were shifted from one corner to another. New equipment was hauled in. Old gear was reinforced with makeshift repairs. Tool cabinets were reorganized, overhauled, emptied, refilled. Engineers sketched blueprints over old tables stained with grease and years of peaceful work. Welders rigged new steel frames. Electricians rewired entire floors because the increased voltage from the new machines overwhelmed the old circuits. The air smelled of fresh paint, hot metal, and the sharp, bitter scent of urgency itself. No one waited for an official announcement. The workforce surged as if carried by instinct. Men who were too old to fight, but too proud to stand idle, walked into the factories with determined steps, offering their hands, their experience, their decades of knowledge. Young boys barely 16 lied about their age to join the production lines, eager to contribute. Women, factory workers, housewives, seamstresses, teachers and shopkeepers stepped across the threshold of heavy industry for the first time. Some carried lunch pails, some carried nervousness, all carried courage. Before long, the factory floors pulsed with life. The first sounds of transformation were hesitant, a hammer striking metal, a drill whining softly, a belt conveyor creaking under new weight. But within weeks, those tentative notes erupted into a full industrial symphony, loud, relentless, and mesmerizing. Presses slammed with bone, shaking force, echoing off concrete walls like artillery impacts. Sparks burst from welding torches in bright showers that momentarily illuminated faces streaked with sweat and grime. The motors of lathes, grinders, and cutting machines screamed with a pitch that crawled into the ears and stayed there long after the shift ended. The floors shook as heavy machinery punched steel sheets into shape. The warm air shimmered above rows of furnaces and heat treatment chambers. Every sense was overwhelmed. Sight, hearing, touch, even smell. The workers adapted to this new battlefield. They learned to communicate with gestures because the noise drowned out voices. They learned to move in fluid patterns around machines, weaving between equipment with precision that only desperation and repetition could teach. Gloves wore thin quickly, boots soaked in oil and coolant. Coveralls became permanently stained with grease. Some workers developed burns from molten metal. Others carried the metallic scent of the machinery home with them every night. Yet the morale did not break. If anything, it strengthened. During lunch breaks, workers gathered around barrels turned into tables. They talked about distant sons fighting in New Guinea, the brothers stationed along the coastline, uncles who had vanished after the fall of Singapore. They spoke in hushed voices about rumors that the Japanese invasion fleet was assembling. They glanced at the sky whenever distant aircraft passed overhead, unsure if the next raid would strike them. And then, when the whistle blew, they returned to their stations with renewed determination. Every finished rifle could arm a soldier. Every shell could turn the tide of a battle. Every truck could transport troops to the front line. The realization that their work, though far from gunfire, was woven into the fabric of survival kept them pushing through exhaustion. The supervisors, many of whom had never imagined themselves commanding military-scale production, walked the aisles with clipboards and strained expressions. They shouted updates, adjusted timelines, assigned emergency shifts, and checked machinery with the urgency of battlefield officers. Assembly lines grew longer as production expanded. New sections of the factory floor were opened, illuminated, wired, and populated with workers in mere days. Metal frames that resembled skeletal forms of weapons, artillery barrels, rifle stocks, vehicle chassis, moved along conveyors and were slowly transformed into instruments of war as they passed from station to station. Even the nights felt alive. Australia's wartime factories never slept. Under the moon's pale glow, the buildings lit up from within like furnaces of defiance. Windows flickered with orange sparks, white welding flashes, and the rhythmic shadows cast by moving workers. Outside, the roads were lined with trucks delivering steel, timber, rubber, copper wiring, and all the raw materials the factories consumed like fire-devouring tinder. Inside, second and third shifts clocked in. These crews were quieter, not because they lacked energy, but because fatigue carved lines into their faces. Yet their silence was purposeful, disciplined, and unwavering. The smell of burnt oil clung to the night air. Steam drifted in soft clouds from vents. The ground trembled under the repetitive thuds of hydraulic presses. And in the break rooms, workers rested slumped against walls, catching minutes of sleep before returning to machines demanding their full attention. Meanwhile, outside these factories, the public grew increasingly aware of what was happening behind these walls. Newspapers ran headlines. By the middle of 1942, something extraordinary began to unfold inside Australia's wartime factories. Something no blueprint had predicted, no official report had dared to hope for. What started as a frantic effort to survive became a roaring wave of industrial momentum, rising faster and higher than anyone imagined possible. The factories were no longer simply reacting to crisis. They were evolving, expanding, adapting with a speed that shocked even their own engineers. As the war outside intensified, the production lines inside Australia accelerated with a power that felt almost alive. Vehicle assembly lines, which had once produced only a modest output, suddenly stretched the length of entire industrial districts. What used to be a set of basic, slow, moving lines became an interconnected web of manufacturing corridors where metal frames rolled forward in seamless motion. Every few seconds, a new part clicked into place. A chassis lowered onto an engine block, a steel panel hammered into alignment, a tire mounted onto a still, warm axle. The air buzzed with the constant vibration of machinery. Workers leaned into their tasks, the sweat dripping from their foreheads onto newly forged steel. Some wiped their faces with oil-stained rags. Others tied bandanas around their heads to keep hair and sweat from falling into their eyes. Nothing slowed them. Nothing distracted them. In the ammunition plants, the transformation was even more dramatic. At first, production quotas seemed impossible, tens of thousands of rounds per week, then hundreds of thousands. But once the systems locked into place, once the teams learned the rhythm, once every worker understood not just their task, but the significance behind it, the output surged. Machines clattered, stamped, and pressed metal casings in endless succession. The smell of heated brass mixed with the faint, sharp aroma of propellant powders. Workers handled freshly stamped shells that were still warm to the touch. They inspected each round with hardened eyes, knowing that a single flaw could mean a soldier's death. They checked the grooves, the caps, the weight. They listened for the faint rattle of an improperly seated primer. They rejected anything questionable without hesitation. There was no room for error, and so perfection became second nature. In the communications equipment facilities, converted from radio shops, electrical companies, and even university laboratories, women learned to solder wiring into compact radio sets with precision that astonished US and British officers. Their hands worked delicately, even when trembling from exhaustion. The tips of their fingers often carried tiny burns from the hot soldering irons. Their eyes were strained from long hours, peering into components the size of fingernails. But when a newly assembled radio crackled to life for the first time, its signal reaching across a testing hall, it felt like a victory every single time. As the factories grew more confident, Production no longer simply met expectations, it shattered them. The lines moved faster. The workers became more skilled. Solutions to technical problems emerged quicker than the problems themselves. Engineers revised designs on the fly to improve efficiency. Supervisors reorganized workflow to reduce wasted steps. Mechanics modified machines so they could operate for longer hours without overheating. Whatever could be improved was improved. Whatever could be accelerated was accelerated. Everywhere the atmosphere changed. No longer was the air thick with fear and desperation alone. Now, it carried something else, something powerful. It carried pride. Men and women who had once doubted their ability to work in heavy industry were now masters of their stations. They operated drill presses, cutting machines, riveting equipment, and hydraulic presses with the skill of seasoned veterans. Conversations that once carried whispers of uncertainty now brimmed with determination and confidence. Workers compared output numbers with excitement. Teams competed with each other to finish assemblies faster. Lunch rooms buzzed not with fear, but with stories of last night's progress, told with exhausted smiles, told with a sense of belonging that had not existed months earlier. And yet, the fatigue was real. It set deep into bones and muscles. Nights were short. Shifts were long. Many workers barely saw daylight except through factory windows. The mothers left children with neighbors or relatives so they could take the night shift. Fathers who had never imagined working under such pressure now knew every vibration of the steel conveyor belts by memory. Young men who had lied about their age carried themselves like adults. Even teenagers developed calloused hands, dark circles under their eyes, and an unshakable maturity forged in steel and response. Outside the factories, trains arrived constantly, bringing raw materials from across the continent. Steel from Newcastle, copper from South Australia, rubber from wherever it could still be sourced, timber from Queensland, coal from all over. The sound of freight trains clanking into industrial yards became part of the nation's wartime soundtrack. Workers unloaded crates with urgency, stacking them onto trolleys that disappeared into the glowing interior of the factories like offerings being carried into a sacred temple. Inside, heat thickened the air. The floors trembled with each press of machinery. The lighting carried a faint flicker caused by the strain on the electrical grids. Cooling vents spewed hot steam. The metallic tang of iron filings coated the tongue. And over all of it, above the hammering steel, the clattering conveyors, and the screech of metal on metal, there was a constant roar of determination, as if the factories themselves breathed in iron and exhaled purpose. But what truly set this moment apart was the unity. Australians of every background, every age, every class found themselves working side by side. Bank clerks operated saws. Housewives shaped artillery components. Office typists carried heavy crates of spare parts. Farmers who had never stepped foot inside a factory suddenly managed assembly lines with efficiency learned at astonishing speed. And when American officers toured the facilities, sent to inspect whether Australia could truly support the Pacific Theatre, they walked through the buildings in stunned silence. One officer remarked privately that he had expected to find fear, chaos, and overwhelmed civilians. Instead, he found an industrial army, disciplined, focused, relentless. Reports sent to Washington described something remarkable. Australia's civilian workforce operates with the urgency of soldiers under fire. And though no official would ever publicly say it, many believe the strength of these factories convinced Allied commanders that Australia could serve as a vital supply, and staging base in the Pacific campaign. Back inside the ammunition plants, the tempo increased even further. Millions of rounds rolled off the lines. Workers stacked crates so high they formed towering walls of firepower. Forklifts hummed as they carried new shipments across the floor. The smell of ink rose from freshly stenciled markings, dates, calibers, lot numbers. Workers wiped sweat from their brows with the backs of their sleeves, barely stopping before returning to their stations. The pace was unyielding, but the mission was clear. In the vehicle factories, progress was equally dramatic. Trucks rolled forward in perfect rhythm. Mechanics checked engines one after another, listening for irregularities, adjusting valves, tightening bolts. Workers on the line fitted windshields, hammered panels into place, installed seats, attached fuel tanks. The clangs and thuds merged into a kind of industrial heartbeat, steady and strong. When a truck finally rolled off the line after hours of coordinated effort, the workers didn't cheer loudly. They simply nodded, proud but calm, before returning to build the next one. As 1942 pushed into its most dangerous and uncertain months, Australia's wartime factories reached a level of intensity few outside their walls could ever imagine. What had begun as a desperate scramble to survive the Japanese advance had now transformed into a roaring engine of national resistance. An industrial force that defied fear, exhaustion, and the limits of what anyone believed Australia could accomplish. The stakes were higher than ever. The pressure was relentless. Every worker felt the weight of the Pacific War pressing down on their shoulders like an invisible hand. Rumors of invasion swirled constantly. Stories of Japanese submarines patrolling the coastline made their way into newspapers and whispered conversations in break rooms. Air raid sirens punctured the night air like sudden bursts of terror, sending entire factories scrambling into shelters, only to return moments later to the machines that never stopped roaring. Yet, the work continued. Production never halted. Every shift carried a sense of urgency that bordered on ferocity. The workers, grease-stained, exhausted, and driven, moved through the factory floors with expressions carved from determination. Each day, they produced more weapons, more ammunition, more vehicles, more spare parts. Each night, they returned home with aching limbs and ringing ears, only to rise again before dawn and return to the furnace of industry. By this time, Australia's wartime production had achieved what most had thought impossible: the output necessary to arm, equip, and supply 10 full fighting divisions. This fact alone astonished Allied commanders. It wasn't just impressive, it was unprecedented. Other nations with far greater populations and larger economies struggled to reorganize their industries so quickly. But Australia, isolated, threatened, and fighting from the edge of the world, had done it with breathtaking speed. Factories that a year earlier had produced bicycles or household appliances were now turning out mortar barrels and armored vehicle parts. Workshops that once repaired farm machinery were now assembling artillery guns destined for frontline units. Even small machine shops hidden in rural towns were producing components that fed into the larger network of wartime supply. The sheer scale of it felt like a miracle, but it was a miracle forged in sweat, fear, and an unwavering will to survive. Inside one of the largest factory complexes, workers moved as if guided by a single heartbeat. Giant furnaces glowed like the cores of captured stars, radiating heat that shimmered through the air in waves. The floors throbbed under the weight of machines, pounding metal into shape. Sparks cascaded down in bright showers whenever welders fused plates of steel together. The glow from the torches scattered sharp shadows across the walls, highlighting the silhouettes of workers who had become, in many ways, soldiers in their own right. Soldiers armed not with rifles, but with tools that built the lifeline of an army. The fatigue was obvious. You could see it in the droop of shoulders, in the way workers leaned against machines between cycles, in the quick, deep breaths they took when supervisors weren't looking. But the determination burned brighter than the exhaustion. Every man and woman knew what failure meant. They knew what defeat would bring. They had seen what happened to territories that fell under the Japanese war machine. They had heard the stories from Singapore, from Malaya, from the Philippines. They understood that if Australia's defences failed, the war would come to their homes, their streets, their children. And so they pushed themselves harder. Some workers operated machinery for hours without rest, hands trembling from the vibration of tools. Others ran supply carts back and forth across the floor, weaving through overcrowded aisles with the precision of dancers, dodging sparks, steam vents, and swinging crane hooks. In the assembly areas, teams tightened bolts, aligned gears, attached sights to newly completed artillery pieces. They worked in tight formation, each step practiced, each movement efficient. They shouted over the deafening hum when necessary, but mostly, they communicated with gestures, quick nods, hand signals, the silent language of people who had spent months standing beside the same roaring machines. Then, something happened that would mark a turning point in Australia's wartime role. Allied forces, particularly American units arriving to reinforce the Pacific theatre, began visiting the factories not just for inspection, but for supply. What they found stunned them. They had expected a small, struggling industrial effort, barely able to support Australia's own defence. Instead, they walked into a storm of activity. Endless rows of machines, conveyor lines stretching into the distance, warehouses filled with crates, stacked from floor to ceiling. They saw vehicle fleets being assembled with astonishing speed. They watched ammunition belts being packed for shipment. They witnessed radio sets being tested, their crackling signals bouncing through testing rooms filled with the scent of hot solder and electrical ozone. One American officer, unable to hide his amazement, whispered to a colleague that the Australians were running factories like frontline battalions. Others wrote reports describing the output levels as nothing short of miraculous. Even British officials, who had once doubted Australia's ability to mobilise on such a scale, began sending messages of praise across the empire. The factories weren't simply supporting Australia now. They were contributing to the entire Allied war effort in the Pacific. The pressure, however, only increased. As demand grew, the factories expanded even further. More buildings opened. More shifts were added. Raw materials flowed in through ports and railway stations. Storage yards filled with mountains of steel ingots, rubber tires, wooden crates, cable spools, and stacks of unfinished components. Trucks lined up outside the loading bays, waiting to be filled. The smell of petrol and hot rubber lingered in the air outside the gates. Inside, the heat from the machinery created a constant haze that blurred the edges of the world, making the factory floor look like a battleground illuminated by molten light. Air raid drills continued, sometimes interrupting the work, sometimes ignored when supervisors judged the threat low. But even during the drills, workers moved quickly, efficiently, in practiced formation. Some carried their tools with them into shelters, unwilling to waste a second once the alarm cleared. Under moonlit nights, The factories glowed like industrial fortresses. Their windows pulsed with the flicker of welding arcs. Shadows of cranes and workers stretched long across the ground. Trucks rumbled down dark roads, transporting newly finished weapons to secret storage sites or transport ships. The sound of engines, metal, and movement echoed across the suburbs, a constant reminder that the war was not confined to distant jungles. The war lived inside these cities, inside these factories, inside these people. And yet, somehow, amid all the tension and exhaustion, moments of triumph emerged. When a new artillery piece rolled out perfectly assembled, the crew responsible would stand a moment taller. When a record number of shells were completed in a single shift, the workers exchanged proud glances. When a visiting officer remarked on the quality of equipment, smiles flickered briefly across weary faces. These victories, though small, fueled the spirit of the entire workforce. Australia's factories had not only saved the nation from collapse, they had altered the course of the Pacific War. By late 1942, the output was staggering. Entire divisions could be equipped with Australian-made gear, ammo, rifles, trucks, uniforms, communication sets, spare parts, tools, field supplies. The warehouses filled with stockpiles of everything an army required. Rows of assembled vehicles stretched across open yards like a mechanical army waiting quietly for deployment. Stacks of artillery barrels gleamed under the sun. Ammunition crates towered like walls ready to feed hungry frontlines. In these final months of the year, the realization struck deeply across the nation. Australia had not just endured a crisis, it had risen into a new identity. Through steel and unity, through sacrifice and unwavering effort, it had proven itself capable of something extraordinary. The workers who stepped out of their factories each dawn didn't merely finish a shift. They stepped into history. Their hands, scarred and stained, had shaped a nation's survival. Their sweat had forged the weapons that would help drive back the tide of war. They were no longer simply factory laborers. They were guardians of a continent, and as the sun set over the smoking rooftops of wartime industry, the world beyond the factories finally understood what Australia had become. A nation that refused to break, a nation that refused to fall, a nation whose strength was built not only on soldiers, but on ordinary people who chose to fight with steel instead of rifles.